The echo that wasn't mine location, Rocky Mountains, Colorado. Last summer, Jay, an avid hiker, took a solo trip to a secluded area of the Rockies. The trail wound through thick pine forests before opening into a high-altitude meadow. Wanting to soak in the view, Jay paused at the meadow's edge and let out a cheerful shout that echoed off the cliffs around him. Woohoo! Woohoo! The echo returned. Jay grinned, yelling again, "This place is amazing! This place is amazing!" The repetition was perfect, but something felt off. The echo seemed too quick, as if it wasn't bouncing off the cliffs but answering him directly. Jay frowned, his breath fogging in the crisp air. He yelled a third time, "Who's out there? Who's out there?" Came the eerie mimic. Only it wasn't quite the same. The voice was distorted, slower, almost mocking. Jay froze, scanning the meadow. Movement caught his eye, something tall and shadowy shifting between the trees on the far side. Jay didn't wait to see more. He turned and ran, ignoring the prickling sensation of being watched. Later that night, in his tent, he swore he heard his own voice whispering his name just outside. He cut his trip short the next morning. The missing camper location, Appalachian Trail, North Carolina. Jess and her boyfriend Mark were camping deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Their site was miles from the nearest road, surrounded by thick woods. On the second night, around midnight, Jess woke to the sound of rustling outside the tent. "Mark," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Something's out there." Mark grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam swept the campsite, revealing nothing but their backpacks and fire pit. "It's just the wind," he muttered, crawling back inside. Jess wasn't convinced. The sound had been deliberate, like footsteps. She lay awake for hours, listening. Around 3 a.m., she heard it again, soft crunching, like someone stepping carefully through leaves. This time, Mark heard it too. He sat up, gripping a knife from his pack. "Hello?" he called. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, circling the tent. Jess held her breath, clutching her phone. Then, the steps stopped. And there was a low, guttural laugh. When Mark burst out of the tent, brandishing the knife, their flashlight revealed nothing. But in the morning, they found footprints, bare human footprints, leading away from their site. A ranger later told them a camper had gone missing in that area the year before. The man was never found. The cabin with no exit location, Sierra Nevada, California. Rachel and her 3 friends were backpacking through the Sierra Nevada when they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was late, and a storm was rolling in, so they decided to shelter there for the night. The inside was sparse, a broken table, a few chairs, and a fireplace. Dust coated every surface. As they settled in, Rachel noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, spirals, jagged lines, and crude stick figures. "That's creepy," she muttered, snapping a picture with her phone. Around midnight, Rachel woke to a thumping noise, like someone knocking on the walls. She sat up, heart racing. "Guys, did you hear that?" Her friends stirred, but before they could respond, the knocking came again, louder, faster. It seemed to move around the cabin, from wall to wall. Terrified, they decided to leave. But when they tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, seemed stuck, as if the storm had warped the wood. Panic set in as the knocking grew deafening. Then, in the flickering firelight, Rachel saw something, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, watching. When morning came, the cabin was empty, except for Rachel. She was found days later, wandering the woods, muttering about the man in the corner. Her friends were never seen again. The hiker who followed me location, Mount Rainier, Washington. Lucy was hiking alone on a popular trail in Mount Rainier National Park. It was late in the season, and the once busy paths were now nearly empty. The weather was crisp, the leaves rustling in the occasional breeze. About 2 hours into her trek, Lucy became aware of a sound, a steady crunch of footsteps that matched hers. She glanced back, expecting to see another hiker, but the trail behind her was empty. She resumed walking, telling herself it was nothing, but the footsteps started again. This time, they sounded closer. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The next mile was agonizing. The footsteps would start and stop at random intervals, always just out of sight. Finally, she reached an overlook and turned to confront whoever, or whatever, was following her. There was no one. She stood there, her breath visible in the cold air, when she heard it again. But now the sound wasn't behind her. It was on the trail ahead. Panicking, she ran back the way she came. When she reached her car, there was a piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. Written in shaky, smeared pencil was a single sentence. "I just wanted to walk with you." The Crying in the Canyon location, Grand Canyon, Arizona. A park ranger, Ben, was patrolling a remote part of the Grand Canyon when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a child crying. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. Ben immediately called it in and began searching the area. He followed the sound down a narrow, rocky trail that twisted deep into the canyon. The crying grew louder, and he swore he could hear a voice calling, "Help me." But as he descended, something strange happened. The sound started moving. First it was to his left, then behind him, then impossibly ahead. No matter how fast he walked, he couldn't seem to catch up. Finally, he stopped, realizing he was deep in a part of the canyon even he didn't know well. The crying had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence. When he tried to retrace his steps, he discovered the trail was gone. In its place was a sheer drop into darkness. Panicked, he radioed for backup but received only static. Hours later, he was found by a search team, dazed and wandering near his starting point. To this day, Ben swears he never saw the child. And when he replayed the audio from his radio, he heard faint crying in the background, even though no one else had heard it at the time. The Watcher and the Fire Lookout location, Bitterroot Mountains, Idaho/Montana border. Amber was a fire lookout stationed in a remote tower in the Bitterroot Mountains. The isolation was peaceful at first, but as the days stretched into weeks, she began to feel uneasy. Every night, she'd climb the steep staircase to her small cabin perched high above the trees. The sunsets were beautiful, but the nights were suffocatingly dark, with nothing but the sound of wind and the occasional howl of a distant animal. One night, as she was preparing for bed, Amber glanced out the window and froze. At the edge of the clearing below the tower was a figure, tall and shadowy, standing perfectly still. Her radio crackled, startling her, but it was just static. When she looked back, the figure was gone. The next night, it returned. This time, it was closer, standing at the base of the tower. Amber shone her flashlight, but the beam didn't seem to reach it. She locked the door and stayed awake until dawn. For the next 3 nights, the figure appeared, always a little closer. On the 4th night, she woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the stairs outside. When she finally worked up the courage to open the door at dawn, there was nothing there. But carved into the wooden railing were the words, "Not safe up high." The cabin below the glacier location, Denali National Park, Alaska. A group of mountaineers were attempting a grueling climb near Denali when a blizzard forced them to take shelter in an unexpected place, an abandoned cabin they stumbled across near the base of a glacier. The cabin was ancient, with warped wood and a sagging roof. Inside, the air was damp and freezing, and the only furniture was a single cot and a wood-burning stove. As the group huddled for warmth, one of them noticed something unsettling. Nailed to the walls were dozens of photographs, all black and white portraits of people staring directly at the camera. "Creepy," one of them muttered, brushing snow off his jacket. That night, the wind howled around the cabin, shaking its fragile walls. One by one, the mountaineers fell asleep, except for Chris, who kept staring at the photographs. Something about them seemed wrong. In the flickering light of their lantern, he realized the faces had changed. Where before the people had neutral expressions, they were now smiling, wide, unnatural grins. Chris woke the others, panicking, but when they looked, the photos were back to normal. The group tried to laugh it off, blaming exhaustion, but none of them could sleep after that. In the morning, as they packed up to leave, Chris noticed one last thing. There was a new photo on the wall. It was of their group, taken from somewhere inside the cabin. The disappearance of the hiker. In the early 2000s, a seasoned hiker named Mark ventured into the Sierra Nevada mountains for a solo trip. He was an experienced outdoorsman, familiar with the trails and the terrain. After a few days, his family grew worried when they hadn't heard from him. Search teams combed the mountains for weeks, but there was no trace of Mark. Years later, a local man hiking near the same area came across an eerie discovery: Mark's backpack, lying at the base of a cliff. However, there was no sign of his body. Oddly, the zipper of the backpack was still intact, and inside, his journal revealed an unsettling last entry: "I heard something. It's getting closer." The man who found the backpack swears he saw strange shadows moving in the distance. Some believe Mark was lost to something far darker than nature. To this day, no one has been able to explain his mysterious disappearance. The mysterious creature in the Rockies. In the rugged Rockies, a group of campers experienced something that still haunts them. It started as a normal trip, a few friends enjoying the peace and quiet of the wilderness. On the third night, they began hearing strange noises coming from the woods, guttural growls, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps circling their camp. One of the campers, a woman named Sarah, decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the dark. As she approached the edge of the forest, she was struck by an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the beam of her flashlight caught movement: a tall, shadowy figure, its eyes glowing yellow, staring directly at her. Terrified, she rushed back to camp, but the creature followed, its presence lingering just outside their campfire's glow. They could hear it breathing heavily and moving around them, but it never came into the light. When they finally packed up to leave at dawn, they noticed strange, claw-like marks on the ground near their tents. They left the mountains immediately, and none of them ever spoke of what they saw again. The ghost of the lost miner. The mountains near Telluride, Colorado, have long been rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a miner who vanished during the gold rush. A couple visiting the area for a hiking trip decided to explore an old, abandoned mine shaft. They had heard the stories about the ghost, but didn't believe in such things, until that day. As they wandered deeper into the mine, the temperature dropped significantly, and they began to feel a strange presence surrounding them. The woman, looking down at the ground, noticed something odd: an old, rusty pickaxe lying in the dirt. She picked it up, and almost instantly, a voice echoed from the depths of the mine: "Leave it. That's mine." Terrified, they bolted out of the mine, but they heard footsteps following them, as if someone or something was hot on their heels. When they made it to the exit, they turned to look back, only to see a shadowy figure standing at the mine's entrance, its features obscured, but the unmistakable outline of an old miner's hat visible. They never returned to the mountains, and the locals continued to tell the tale of the ghostly miner who haunts the abandoned shafts, still guarding his lost treasure. The Haunted Trail of Mount Hood. In Oregon, the Mount Hood Wilderness is known for its beauty and its dark history. A young couple decided to hike one of the popular trails on the mountain, unaware that they were about to experience something truly terrifying. As they made their way through a thick part of the forest, they noticed a small cabin nestled between the trees. Curious, they approached and found it seemingly abandoned. As they explored the interior, they came across a dusty old journal, with entries dating back to the 1800s. The last page was unfinished, but the words scribbled in a frantic hand read: "It's them. They don't let you leave. They follow, always." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the forest. They ran out of the cabin, but something was wrong. The forest felt unnaturally silent, and they could hear faint whispers behind them, though no one was there. They hurried back to the trailhead, but as they neared the parking lot, they saw something that froze them in place: a figure standing by their car, just watching them. When they got into their car and drove away, they looked back to see the same figure now standing at the edge of the trail, slowly waving goodbye. They never spoke about the incident again. The Vanishing Hunter. A man named Tom, an avid hunter, set out for a weekend in the Adirondacks, excited for a solo hunting trip in the dense forest. He had been hunting in the area for years, but this time, something felt different. As he set up camp, he began to feel a constant unease, as though someone was watching him. On the second day, Tom went deeper into the woods, tracking deer. As he crossed a small stream, he noticed fresh tracks, but they weren't deer tracks. They were large, human-like footprints, though far too large to be human. His heart started racing. He followed the tracks, but they led him to a clearing, and then, without warning, they vanished. Panicking, Tom turned to head back to camp, but the woods had become disorienting. He couldn't find his way. Hours passed, and as dusk began to fall, Tom's flashlight flickered and died. He tried to call for help on his phone, but there was no signal. The search for Tom lasted several days, but he was never found. The only thing recovered was his rifle, found abandoned by the stream where he had first noticed the strange tracks. Locals say that the Adirondacks have long been cursed, and Tom may have fallen victim to something that stalks the woods, preying on those who venture too deep. The Whispering Pines of Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta in Northern California is known for its natural beauty, but it also has a reputation for strange occurrences. A family on a camping trip near the base of the mountain encountered something that they couldn't explain. On the second night of their stay, the wind began to pick up, and the tall pines surrounding their campsite started making an unusual noise. It wasn't the normal rustling of leaves but something like faint whispers. At first, they thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but the whispers grew louder, almost forming words. The father, convinced it was just a trick of nature, stood up to investigate. As he moved deeper into the trees, the whispers grew more insistent, urging him to follow the path. When he finally returned to the campsite, his face was pale, and his eyes wide with fear. The family packed up immediately and left, but as they drove away, they could still hear the faint whispers carried on the wind, calling their names. They never spoke of the event again, but local legends say Mount Shasta has a long history of strange occurrences, with hikers and campers sometimes hearing the whispers of the pines, which some believe are the voices of those lost to the mountain. The Shadow Man of the Adirondacks. In the dense forests of the Adirondack Mountains in New York, there have been numerous reports of a strange figure that seems to appear at the edge of the woods. Several hikers and campers have shared eerie encounters with the Shadow Man, a tall, dark figure who watches from the tree line, then vanishes when approached. One story comes from a group of friends who were camping in the area. They were sitting around the campfire, telling stories and enjoying the night, when one of them noticed a tall, dark figure standing silently just outside their camp. They assumed it was another camper, but when they called out, the figure did not respond. The figure's posture was unnaturally still, and it appeared to be staring directly at them. As they approached, the figure suddenly turned and walked into the forest. When they followed, the figure vanished without a trace. As they made their way back to the camp, they noticed footprints leading into the trees, footprints that did not match any of their own. The group packed up and left, but the unsettling feeling stayed with them for years. Locals claim that the Shadow Man is the restless spirit of someone who disappeared in the Adirondacks long ago, doomed to haunt the area for eternity. The Vanishing Trail of the White Mountains. A family hiking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire came across a trail that wasn't on any map. The trail was narrow, overgrown with moss, and seemed to lead into an untouched part of the forest. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to follow it, despite the sense of unease they felt. After a few hours of hiking, the trail took a sharp turn and led them to a small clearing. In the middle was a dilapidated cabin, long abandoned. The family decided to explore it, but as they stepped inside, they felt an oppressive atmosphere. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, and the air was thick with a strange, musty smell. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from deeper in the woods. The family quickly left the cabin and retraced their steps, but when they reached the fork where they had originally turned onto the trail, the path was gone. The trees had grown closer together, and the area now looked completely different, as if the trail had never existed. Frantic, they searched for hours but found no trace of the mysterious path. Eventually, they stumbled onto another trail, and though they were shaken, they made it back to their car. The family never spoke of the incident again. Some say the vanishing trail is a known phenomenon in the White Mountains, a path that leads to nowhere, only to return once it's ready to release its lost travelers. The Crying Woman of Mount McKinley. Mount McKinley, or Denali, is the highest peak in North America, and its vast wilderness has a history of unsettling legends. A group of experienced climbers made their way up the mountain in the dead of winter, hoping to summit the peak. As they approached the final ridge, they began hearing a strange sound, a woman sobbing, faint but distinct. They assumed it was the wind, but it continued, growing louder as they climbed higher. The climbers halted, unsure of where the sound was coming from. They searched the area, but there was no one in sight. The sobbing seemed to come from the mountains themselves, echoing off the rocks. One of the climbers, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, suggested they turn back, but another insisted they continue. As they pushed forward, the sobbing grew more frantic, but then, suddenly, it stopped. The group reached the summit, but as they set up camp, the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. That night, one of the climbers reported seeing a shadowy figure on the ridge, a woman, dressed in white, her face obscured by her long hair, standing at the edge of a cliff, silently staring into the abyss. Terrified, the climbers packed up and descended the mountain. Later, they learned that the area was rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a woman who had vanished on the mountain decades earlier, her cries forever echoing in the cold winds. The Lost Village in the Cascades. Deep within the Cascade Range in Washington, there are stories of a long-forgotten village hidden in the forest, where no one has dared to go. The village, abandoned for over a century, is said to be haunted by the souls of its former inhabitants. A group of hikers decided to explore the area, eager to uncover the mystery of the lost village. As they ventured deeper into the mountains, they found remnants of old buildings, half buried by moss and vegetation. They came across old stone foundations and rotting timber, but the further they explored, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Strange symbols were carved into the trees around them, and the air grew unnaturally still. At dusk, the group decided to head back, but they found that the path they had walked was no longer recognizable. The forest seemed to have changed, the trees were different, and they felt as though they were being watched. They heard faint voices on the wind, but no one was around. They stumbled upon a small clearing, where they saw a figure in the distance, a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing still and staring at them. As they moved closer, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the eerie sound of whispering that seemed to come from nowhere. The hikers finally made it out, but the experience left them shaken. Local legends speak of the lost village, its inhabitants now wandering in the woods, trapped between worlds. The Beast of the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across several states, but some parts are known for their particularly eerie reputation. One of the most terrifying stories comes from a hiker named Tim, who was exploring the remote trails of the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. Tim was an experienced outdoorsman, and he often hiked alone, but this trip would be different. One evening, after a long day of hiking, Tim set up camp in a secluded area. As night fell, he started hearing strange, guttural growls coming from the woods. He thought it might be a bear or a mountain lion, but the sound was unlike anything he had ever heard. It seemed to come from multiple directions, all around him. The growls were low and deep, with occasional huffs of breath. When Tim finally mustered the courage to shine his flashlight into the darkness, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a massive creature, covered in dark fur. Its eyes gleamed in the light, and it stood perfectly still, staring at him. Tim's heart pounded as he quickly packed up his gear and made his way back to the main trail. the creature's growls still echoing behind him. He made it back to the safety of his car, but what haunted him most wasn't just the sight of the beast, but the sense that it had been watching him for hours. Locals claim that this beast is a creature that has been seen in these mountains for centuries, and some even believe it is a supernatural entity tied to the Appalachian folklore.